And then I'm going to introduce you to Career Exploration and Development's Executive Director, Kristen Williams, who's going to start us off with about a 30-minute presentation on negotiation. That'll be followed with 30 minutes of breakout sessions, and we'll talk more about how to get into the breakout sessions after Kristen is finished. If you have any questions in the meantime, please feel free to drop them in the chat, but please keep your microphone muted unless we call on you, just to reduce background noise. And I'll kick it off to Kristen. Thank you, Kristen, for being here.
Thanks, Julie, and welcome everyone. I hope you're looking forward to learning a little bit about negotiating today. I have several colleagues here from our Career Exploration and Development team, as Julie mentioned. So if you have a question or a comment, or you want me to clarify or expand on something as we go through this, please put that into the chat. This is going to be a lot of information coming at you from a lot of different angles quickly. So the breakout sessions after this presentation will be a good way to be able to practice and also think about how you might implement your negotiating strategies as you're in the job search or in the job offer process. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, but again, I want this to be a time for you to ask questions or get things clarified, so don't hesitate to do that as we're moving along. So Julie mentioned this, we're recording. Please go ahead and mute your microphones if they're not already done. Either use the raise your hand feature or put any specific comments or questions in the chat. We'll talk about this, so I'll go back to this towards the end and how we get into the breakout rooms, and we have 2 topics as we get there. So we'll do that as soon as this presentation is over. Let me talk about the goals for what we're going to cover in the first 30 minutes. I want to go over what the goal of negotiating is with you. It might be just what you were thinking, or it might turn out that there's a different goal. What is compensation? So we hear that term, but I want to break it out and really walk through the different pieces and parts that often an organization or a company think about, or what they mean when they're talking to you about compensation. Important component of negotiating is preparation and having a plan. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you can do that. When you receive a job offer, part of negotiating will be to have a counter offer. So we're going to talk about offer and counter offer. And then there's an interactive piece that will actually happen in one of the breakout sessions. But practicing that offer counter offer is really critical at feeling comfortable in negotiations. So there'll be an opportunity for you to do that. And Q&A, even though I have it listed here as the last bullet point, is something that we can really have happen throughout the presentation. Just, again, drop those in the chat. So what is the goal of negotiating? Well, you have a goal that might be to earn more money. I will share with you throughout this presentation that the salary itself is not the only factor that we'll talk about, but really what you want to be able to do with a job offer negotiation is get to a place where you have a mutual agreement with the employer who's offered you the job, that they're meeting your needs and you're meeting their needs, because it ends up being, in that regard, a win-win for you and for the employer. Maybe you were drawn to this presentation based on some of the information you saw about the session. It's going to positively impact your lifelong earnings. And I'll show you a slide at the very end of this that estimates how much, but you might guess it can have about $1 million impact over your lifetime, even a minimal negotiation to your salary, your starting salary. So the goals are really threefold. Come to that win-win, have a mutually beneficial agreement, and have a positive impact on your lifelong earnings. We are going to go through these one at a time in more detail, but overall I wanted to give you a big picture. What is compensation? Oftentimes, the very first thing we think of is the top bullet point here. We think of our salary or our wages. What did they offer me in terms of either an hourly wage or an annual salary? That's compensation. But it's really so much more. It's also the development or training opportunities that we would have from our employer, performance and recognition, so things like bonuses or raises based on merit. Work-life, you probably hear this in terms of balance a lot. I like to call them work-life satisfiers, things that make this satisfactory for me? And then benefits, which for some of us going into our first job might not even be something that's immediately on our radar that we're thinking about, but benefits are a huge factor, and they're not just things like your health insurance. That's one component, but we'll break them down even further as we go along. So for some of you, you might be sitting here thinking at this point, like, wow, that's so much more than I thought it was. I just think of negotiating, or I just think of a job offer in terms of the salary and wage. And if that's you, that's great, because I'm going to give you then some tools how you can negotiate beyond just salary and wage as we go through this. So let's talk about salary and wage. It is, of course, the dollar amount that shows up on the job offer. X dollars per year annual salary, or X dollars per hour for a certain number of hours a week. It also includes, or can also include, things like a signing bonus. There are organizations from time to time that will offer a bonus for signing on. We see this, at least with our Kent State students, sometimes through our pilots who are getting jobs with airlines, that they're signing on months before, and there's still some training that they have to do before they can start with that airline, so they get a bonus for doing that. Of course, that bonus can be rescinded if they don't meet all of those requirements. Sometimes we see this with accounting students. They're maybe offered a position almost 9 months before they would start it, but they have to do certain things, including graduate, in order to get that bonus. But you can be factored into how you think about that first annual salary. There might be a standard bonus, something that comes in December each year or at the close of the fiscal year, that is sort of built into the practice of the organization, but isn't necessarily guaranteed. So I point out standard bonus because I often caution people not to think about this as your total wage. It is going to be factored into your salary for taxation purposes and for your earning history over that year. But if it's not guaranteed, it isn't something that you should think about as something you can count on for that total salary. It's a bonus, so it's obviously a good thing when it happens, but it can be based on a certain number of factors, including the company's profits or stocks or anything like that. And then there might be incremental increases. So it might look like you're going to make this much money for your first 90 days, and then pending a positive review, you'll get a bump of X% for the next 180 days. And over time, over that first year, there might be these incremental increases. In that case, it's going to be important that you do the math and figure out what that looks like over time for you, so that you can really get an accurate picture beyond just what that job offer letter might say is your starting salary or wage. A lot of times we use that starting salary or the wage that's on the job offer to compare one offer to another. So it's really important that you're using kind of an apples to apples comparison. And so market data, looking at what other similar positions in similar parts of the country are making or are being offered, is a good way to get to that starting salary data. Lots of rich information through the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Glassdoor can be a really great resource to find this. It is a lot easier to get an accurate picture of salaries from public entities than it is from private entities, but salary data is something that takes a little bit of research to get to that market value of the data. But one of the things I always encourage folks to do is, you see job postings sometimes and they don't even list a salary. It's okay to reach out to HR and ask. I think a safe way to do this, or maybe a way that doesn't feel as threatening, is to ask in terms of a range. So I'm going to pause there. Are there any questions at this point? Okay, I'm going to keep moving on, but I'll keep an eye on the chat. And Tracy and Allison, if you see something and I keep talking, just catch my attention.
No problem.
Thank you. So second part of that pie chart that I shared with you is benefits. And I mentioned it's not always just our health insurance or vision and dental insurance, which we tend to think of kind of as an umbrella of benefits, but it's also things like retirement, and is there a matching program? Will I have a 401k? Does my employer offer stock options for me? It's life insurance, which again, when I was first starting my first job, I remember thinking, why would I need life insurance? But it's something that you want to consider in terms of the value of what you're getting for working for that employer. More and more over time, we're seeing loan forgiveness or payment options as part of the benefits. So it isn't unusual. The last bullet point actually points out this. It isn't unusual that you might see educational benefits, like your employer would pay a part of your tuition if you went on to continue your education. And sometimes that's just for you, and other times that might be for you and family members. But I would say over the last 5, 7 to 10 years, we've seen an increase in employers actually offering a similar benefit, but it's payment or credit towards student loan payments that you might have. So all of those kind of fit into that category of benefits, and you want to consider that as part of that offer as well. And then work life. This doesn't always equate to like a perfectly balanced scale, which is why I don't use that image on this slide, but it's a whole host of things that you might want to consider. And so some of them are listed here. More and more today. When I first made this slide, we weren't all working remotely like many of us are doing today, but that could be part of this balance. Things like vacation leave, sick leave, paid time off. How do I get to balance my time outside of the office? It might look like flexible scheduling. Is it a rigid 8 to 5, 40-hour-a-week schedule in this office, or is there opportunities to come in, at 9 and leave at 6:30 or 4 days a week, or how does it work? Lots of companies offer club and fitness memberships, some of them even on their campuses or in their buildings. So those come for free. That's a cost that you wouldn't have outside of work. And then company phones and cars might also be part of this work life. I always pause here and I share a couple of tips and stories at this point about both the company phone and the car. One thing to consider if you're accepting these offers, now sometimes they come with the job and you have to accept them in order to get the job, and sometimes they're optional and you don't necessarily have to accept them, but they're part of the offer. I'll start with the phone. The phone is the property of the organization. Now it may be flexible if they're providing you the phone. It may be flexible and you can use it for personal use, but you just want to keep in mind that the company owns that phone. And so like any equipment that you might have at work, the computer, similarly, the company usually can see all of the activity that's happening on that phone. There might also be company phone payments, meaning you use your own personal device, but they're going to reimburse you for that use. Very similarly, in that case, the company also has access to the phone. So one of the things I often, again, tip I give to consider for folks, if there is an option, because you might be thinking company phone, that's great, it's going to save me $150 a month. That sounds really good, but then you have to think about that tip I just gave. Do you want the company having access to the phone? If you get the option to have a company phone, I say take it, and then also have your own phone as well. So if you've kind of paid attention, if you've seen any of our recruiters on campus, you might notice that some of them carry 2 phones. That's probably why. And then this next story is really just because I think it's a funny story that came to light last year. Company cars are not anything new. Folks get them, and usually they have some relaxed privileges for personal driving. In the era of car and ride sharing, this has become something that has, I think, raised red flags for companies that they just didn't think about this before. So my husband, actually, I won't share the company, but works for a company where most everyone gets a company car. And lo and behold, they realized that all of these cars had 9,000, 10,000 more miles on them than they had anticipated. And it turns out that a large number of district managers for this organization who had these cars were Lyft and Uber drivers on the side. So I'm sharing that with you for two reasons. Kind of funny that they would use their company car to do that. So the policy had to change. They had to give some more restrictions about what personal use meant. But also it made me pause and say, well, this is a good consideration. If all of these people were driving for rideshare companies, then maybe there's a bigger consideration for that organization about total compensation for their employees. In theory, they shouldn't need to work two jobs. So anyway, I share that slide here so that you can think of all that might fit into that category of work life. Performance and recognition is another component of total compensation. Is there a career ladder, or do I see, has it been presented to me how I can grow within the organization? Does the organization talk about promotions, or do they talk about hiring externally a lot? It's not a right or a wrong answer, but for you, it's something that you want to consider. Are there incentives? That might look like discounts on things, or access to culture and arts as part of being a part of the organization. They might be incentives based on your performance. So in a sales or B2B related kind of role, there might be things that you get when you hit certain benchmarks. Are there stock options? If it's a newer or growing company, sometimes you'll see this as a way to buy in. But it can also happen with an existing company. It's not unusual for large organizations that are publicly traded to offer stock options. And then this last one is something that we're seeing more and more. Sabbatical tends to be a word we hear frequently in higher education and academia, but in more and more we're hearing it in the private sector as well. Because companies realize the value of their employees, and more often employees don't take all of their vacation time, what companies have started to do is pay for trips. So there's a little bit of a work component, but a lot more of a relaxed component. And so they're paying for you to go see their global office in London, but they want you to embark on a learning quest. And so you spend 3 to 4 weeks there where you're doing a little bit of work, but they're also really just want you to see more of the world and how other folks within their organization live and work. So those things might not all appear in an offer letter, but they're things that you want to dig into and learn more about as the offer comes in. And then this sort of hits on the performance and recognition a little bit too, at least the first one, but you want to think about the development that you'll have in the career opportunities. So again, are we hearing about promotion from within, or is that external? When you start a job, it's likely that you don't know a lot about that specific role. You might know some general things, but you want to have an understanding of what is training going to look like. How do I continually receive training, or what's the education like for employees? Are there professional development opportunities, both internal and external? Do we belong to trade groups or professional organizations affiliated with our company? And mentorship. Mentorship can be formal and informal, but it is something that you want to think about in terms of the offer with that organization. And oftentimes, beyond the salary and maybe some benefits questions, this is the kind of stuff that isn't necessarily going to show up in your offer letter. So how do you get there? How do you know what all these things are if it's not listed somewhere? Well, the first thing with that salary is know the market value for the position. So you want to know what are similar positions in your geography. And the reason I say in your geography or in the geography of the offer is you're all probably aware that cost of living will also drive salary. And so a $100,000 starting salary in San Francisco is not the same as a $100,000 starting salary in Ohio. Neither would be a $40,000 starting salary in San Francisco versus Ohio. So you have to understand what the value of that salary is for the cost of living. And so again, Glassdoor, great way to look at some of those. They have city and market value tip sheets that you can look through. You also want to understand the requirements of the job. So I mentioned similar positions. This doesn't necessarily mean going by title. So business analyst is a widely used title, but it can have a lot of different requirements and role structure within a lot of different organizations. So comparing can be challenging, but you want to try to get down to that apples to apples comparison. Another way to get this research moving is through current employees. And so I will drop in the chat at the end of this a link for one way that you can do that, and that's through LinkedIn. I don't just recommend current employees, I'll even push it a little further and recommend current employees who happen to maybe be Kent State alums. So LinkedIn has this great alumni tool where you can search through more than 150,000 self-identified Kent State alumni and break it down by geography and as well as company where they work. You wouldn't necessarily say to someone, hey, what's your salary? But you can say, this is the kind of stuff I'm finding when I'm researching marketing analyst at your company. Does this seem aligned with what you would offer, with what your organization offers? Similarly, competition in the market. You can look on LinkedIn too for people who work in similar companies, similar roles, and kind of ask that same question. Again, not asking, people are uncomfortable sharing their own salaries, but if you ask general questions, you can see what they make. You can also look at the competition in the market and see, what does it look like right now in terms of their high demand or low demand? Are there lots of job openings for this role, which means there's a high demand? Or are there not a lot of openings for this role? So am I in a buyer's market where I'm going to have more opportunity to negotiate, or does the employer really have the upper hand because there are more openings? And that's going to vary. Actually, right now, in a time where our economy is doing not so well in some sectors, it's doing really well in other sectors. So this isn't a simple answer. You really have to kind of boil it down to your specific role and offer. For me, when I recommend anyone, embarking on negotiation, I find that using a checklist is super helpful. We're going to share one with you, and that is actually going to happen for everyone. We'll share and follow up with the checklist, but you'll have some time to work through it if you choose that breakout session at the end of this presentation. But it helps to really break it down. So what is the offer? And then you're also able to see what you can't see in the offer. So sometimes it'll just tell you the salary. You won't even necessarily know what the benefits are, or you might be wondering, I have to drive a lot for this role. They didn't mention a company car. So breaking it down will help you to see all of the different components. And the checklist that we'll share with you actually has it broken down in that total compensation breakdown so that you can see all the categories. Then it allows you to think about, what's your ideal? Like, if everything went your way, where would you land? Kind of get you a chance to put out your non-negotiables, whatever your kind of breaking point is. At what point would you walk away and not accept the job? But then it also gives you an opportunity to think about what is acceptable. There are some things that are must-haves and some things that are nice to have. And this checklist helps you do the comparison, kind of all in front of you, big picture. Gives you a place to write down your notes, to think about what you bring to the table as a candidate may be different from other candidates, because that's going to be important in the negotiation. And any of that research that you've done, you can jot it down as well. Here's a quick glimpse of it, so you can see it's broken down by those 5 categories. And it's fairly simple. You can take it, you can put it in an Excel spreadsheet, you can print one of these out every single time, but some of our team will work through this with those of you who want to join that particular breakout here later on. So what's going to happen? When do you start negotiating? You're going to get an offer. You're going to do that pause and get out your checklist and then prepare. So before I talk about counteroffers, I also want to pause here because there are sometimes tips and tricks that it's really important for you to pay attention to so that you don't get to a place where you can't negotiate. And so they won't always be overt, sometimes because they can't be, other times because they just aren't. But when we get an offer, usually it's a phone call. And for me, when I'm applying for a job and I'm waiting for the offer, I'm really excited when that phone rings and when it's positive information. So this is going to sound counterintuitive to what you want to do, but you sort of have to train yourself to do this. You don't want to accept the offer right when you get the phone call. Despite all of your excitement, everything that's going on, you can say things like, thank you so much for the call today. You can say, I'm so excited about this. You can even potentially use the words like, yes, this sounds really great. But what you want to do is, as you're getting further through that phone call, is say things like, I'm really excited to see the offer letter. I can't wait to get back to you later today or tomorrow, because what that gives you time to do then is go back and get to that spreadsheet and look at everything before you've just said yes. So I can talk through, for example, when I make offers, when I'm hiring, I tend to say things that might help guide the person, like, I really look forward to hearing back from you by the end of the day on Friday. Or sometimes I intentionally call on a Friday and say, take the weekend and I look forward to hearing back from you on Monday. Sometimes the person making the offer will actually give you those cues. So it's important that you listen for them, because they're giving you that space to do the research. It's also okay in that offer to say, I have some questions about benefits. Can you direct me to someone who could answer those? Oftentimes the person making you the offer is a manager, or even maybe someone in recruiting in HR, and they might not be able to answer all of your questions of specific benefits or things like that. So again, it may sound a little counterintuitive, but you don't want to accept necessarily right when you get that phone call, as excited as you are. I'm sorry, I'm here with my kids, so you're hearing my little one talk to me right now. So when you have the offer, the key with the counter offer is not to turn down the original offer. So how do you not turn down the original offer? You ask questions, which means you're not saying, I don't like X and Y, or I won't do X if Y doesn't change. You might say something like, can you tell me more about how you arrived at that salary? Could I get more information about the benefits? Does this opportunity include telephone reimbursement? Can I learn about tuition reimbursement opportunities? What more can you tell me about paid time off? And all the while, you're referring back to that research where you have made some assessment about what that should look like for this position, and you're also looking at your checklist. That part is what can sometimes feel hard, asking those questions. And sometimes you also have to prepare yourself for, again, that answer that you maybe don't want to hear, because you have an ideal and you have an I can live with it scenario, but you might also have heart set on the fact that the phone was going to come with the job and they tell you, no, we don't provide anyone, cell phone reimbursement. But the key to that is just to always ask questions. So it might be something like, this position's out of state. Does your organization provide relocation assistance? And if they say yes, then that's the opportunity to say, that's something we could include in my offer documentation. And so again, depending on where that conversation goes, they might say yes. The key here is whatever the final offer is. So you might have a written document that has led you, that's the original offer that has led you into these conversations. Whatever you end up with in that resolution through all of your question asking, you want a revised version. You want to get that final offer in writing. And here's why. Oftentimes organizations are big. And so the person who's agreed to these things might have to go through a pretty bureaucratic structure to make it happen. And so having it documented, so for example, you don't want to move from Ohio to California thinking you're going to be reimbursed for your moving assistance, but somehow that never made its way to the accounts payable office. And when you show up, there's no documentation of that. And so you don't get reimbursed for that. So always have it in writing. I'm going to blow through these case studies because they're going to be part of the breakout session. But what makes this really cool is being able to read scenarios and practice. So we will both practice in one breakout session and then work on our checklists in the other. But here's really before I jump into Q&A and wrap up, the reason for this presentation. Taylor and Alex, both entry-level positions-ish, at the age of 22, roughly started with salaries of $49,000 and $50,000 respectively. In this case, Alex, who's showing up here on the red bar line, took the offer, was the excited person on the phone that I described. Nothing wrong with that, being super excited, but accepted without negotiating that $49,000 salary. Taylor, the blue bar line here, just negotiated $1,000 more, but also took into consideration things like maybe having a little extra time off. Was there a mentorship program, an educational program, internal promotions? And you can see that incrementally over time, the annual salary for Alex at age 67 or retirement age has just barely eclipsed that $60,000 range, $63,000, whereas Taylor's is more than double that. And so if you add all those annual salaries up over time, there's $1 million of earnings potential in between. So I'm going to stop there, see if there are questions, and then we're going to get to the practicing, because it's really the practicing asking those questions, looking at the job offers, trying it out, that make this work. Often negotiation can feel like confrontation, and we don't like that. So practicing asking questions versus asking for things helps in this. So let me stop there. Are there any questions?
And I would also like to ask a question while you have this slide up right here that might be helpful to everyone watching. Can you clarify if the tips you shared today are really only useful when negotiating or considering that first time offer? Or do you see some of these tips also being helpful? I'm thinking of Taylor and Alex, if they stayed at the same organization and didn't maybe change companies too frequently throughout their careers, is it still useful? Are these tips helpful if a promotion comes along or a raise? Are those also possible to negotiate, or is this only useful when you're getting a brand new job in that first conversation at the initial offer point?
Super great questions. I see some in the chat too. So I'm going to answer the question that Allison just asked right now. Negotiate every single time. Promotions, next jobs, even within the same organization. And again, it may not be the same negotiation every single time. It may not be salary. It might be something like a new office, literally a new office location within your physical workspace. For me, I always share some of my negotiating stories. I took a position 2 hours away from where my current position is at one point in time. And as I was thinking about coming back to the new position, one of the things that for me was really important was actual help getting there, moving, relocation assistance. At the time that I moved, I had an 8-month-old child and 2 bedrooms worth of stuff in a house. And by the time that I came back, I had 2 children, a lot more stuff, and a baby on the way. So having that relocation assistance was more important to me, factor. And so the other thing to consider with regard to negotiating is it's going to look different for every single person who's doing it. And that's why that checklist of what are my non-negotiables or what are my deal breakers is so important. And so every single time, it might not seem like a big negotiation. It might feel like a little thing for you at the time, but these things can happen at every juncture in your career. So I'm going to go to the next question, which I think, yep, Carrie asked, is negotiating with nonprofit different than for-profit? It can be. Sometimes there's not as much wiggle room depending on the type of organization with things like salary, or sometimes in public space, things like benefits are not negotiable. So, we work at a public state institution in career exploration and development. Benefits are more rigid. They're across the board kind of thing for us. So it can look different with privates and publics, and of course the types of organizations, even within the private space, something that's employee owned versus publicly traded can look a little bit different, but the strategies are the same. So good question here from Christy. How long is acceptable to take between receiving an offer and coming back with a counter offer? It's going to depend, but one thing that I recommend that you person making you the offer, when is it okay to get back to you? If they don't tell you, simply ask that. Now, they might say, I'd like to hear from you in the next 90 minutes. And it's okay to say more time. I didn't tell them I needed more time. Remember, the trick to all of this is always asking questions. But reasonably, I would say it's usually somewhere between 24 and 72 hours response time, and that's just to get back. That's not necessarily to say that this can't take a week to get through all the counteroffer offer stages, because you're asking a series of questions. But you don't want to let it linger too long, but they'll generally, whoever's making you the offer will get you that information. So how do you explicitly negotiate salary? Great question. You want to have your research done. It's not as simple as I need X amount of dollars. Like I've done the math, and to pay my rent and to do these things, I need to make this much money. Have that armed with, here's who I am as a candidate, here's what I see in the market research, and here's what you've offered. So tell me, and I think the question that you ask is, can you tell me how you arrived at this salary? Organizations have folks who work in compensation and human resources who come up with the numbers. For me, with the team I lead, I usually share that documentation. That doesn't necessarily, I can't speak for every organization, but so that's not always necessarily possible, but at the very least, someone should be able to walk you through the steps. When they've done that, you continue to ask a series of questions, and it might just be one question, but can you tell me if there's any wiggle room in that? Or I was thinking something more like this. How does that sound? And you try to get to what is your ideal, but you also have your acceptable in mind. So you can't just necessarily go in and say, I was hoping for $20,000 more. You have to make your case. And you also have to be prepared that they might not meet you there. I will say that there is a strategy of asking for more than what you want, hoping that you'll land on where you want to be, but you always have to have that research and that market data aligned. So it can't just be a number. You need to have it wrapped around with some research. Daisy's asking about sharing the slides. I believe that is possible, and this will be recorded as well, but we will find a way to share the presentation too. So often job descriptions will mention other duties as assigned. How do you recommend negotiation during that process versus during a formal promotion versus taking on new duties? So I think what the question is asking is, could you just have more duties thrown on you because it says other duties as assigned? Generally, that category is not meant to be a catch-all. It's meant to serve as some flexibility. The moment that you notice your position becomes more complex or complicated and really doesn't fit in the scope of work is where you start to maybe have those conversations about promotion. Most organizations have a structure with a staff ombudsperson or a review my role kind of process that can help with this. But honestly, for that, I think open dialogues with supervisors can be super helpful. Workplaces are busy, and oftentimes folks are doing more and more with less. And so while not an excuse for that to happen, I think you have to be able to enter into that dialogue. So if you're having these regular updates, which is something you would want to know when you're getting an offer, how often am I going to communicate with my supervisor? This can be avoided. If you're kind of getting dumped on and everything is just sort of other duties as assigned, you also have to think about the value that you might have for that organization. So how should you negotiate if it's an entry-level job and you don't have multiple years of experience? Remember, I didn't say this at the beginning, but the most important thing about a job offer that we often forget is that we're getting it because we're the person they selected. So they want us. So whether it's entry-level or you've been there 20 years, they want you. And so it isn't necessarily based on experience. It's based on something that they saw in you through the application and interview process. And so depending on what you're negotiating as an entry level, in that entry level, you have to keep that confidence of they've selected me for this role. And so it would be very much the same with my research and asking a series of questions to get there. So I hope that helps a little bit. Oh, thank you. If you feel overqualified and you should be offered more, again, it kind of goes to that research. Now, it can get a little tricky if you have more experience than the job calls for, and the company is also limited to what that pay range might be for the title of the position. It might look a little different. But in general, they should be paying you the worth of that position. So this is also a big key for me, and I didn't mention it until I just thought about it right now. I think the biggest factor in all of this is sharing of previous salaries. Like, my team knows that you can't avoid a job application that asks for this. Tell us your earnings history. If you can avoid putting in a number, meaning lots of application tracking systems make you put something in. If you can avoid putting in a number, I don't recommend putting in a number. And here's why. You should be paid for the value of that job, not based on what you earned in your last job. And I say that because I've been in situations where I was in a job title and salary range that was, $22,000, but I was being paid for the work that I was doing in that job. That shouldn't mean that I go to a job that I do twice that, I should be happy making $30,000. I should be paid for the value of that next job. Now, if you have to put something in, if it doesn't make you put in a number, you can type the word negotiable. But especially in this overqualified position, or the thought that you might be overqualified, salaries can often scare those interviewing away. And what I mean by that is, if they see something that you've earned that maybe seems high for them, whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent, they might say, gosh, that person made too much. They're going to have too high of expectations for the job. Well, we don't always know why someone's applying for something or not. Maybe they're going through a life transition and they don't have any expectation to earn that same salary, or maybe they do. But if you can avoid those numbers, that's something that you would talk about at the point of the offer, not necessarily during the application and interview process. So Cameron, I don't know if I got the answer to your question or not, but you want to make sure that you're really just kind of bringing all the research to the table and making sure that the value of that job is what they're paying. Okay, so I want folks to be able to test this out, and you're going to get to decide in our breakout room. So let me see if I can go back a couple of slides all the way. So sorry for the clicking here. Back in the main, well, where you can see here in the main rooms, you see a breakout room and also the main room that we're in. If you want to practice, there'll be 2 case study slides that will go up. If you want to practice, go into the practice negotiating. And so we'll go cases and say things like, what do you think this person should do? What kind of questions might they ask? You'll want to join that group, and you just click on the little door with the arrow to get there. If you'd like to see that checklist and talk about the components of that checklist, you'll want to go into the Making Your Checklist breakout room. So we'll shift to that now, and our staff will be there to kind of help with these breakout sessions. But thank you, everyone. We'll get this recording up on Handshake, and we'll get the slides to our attendees if you signed in on that Google Doc that Julie put up.
Thank you, Kristen. And just as a reminder, if you don't know how to get into the breakout room, next to the chat, you're going to see 2 little people with a number next to it. You're going to click on that and scroll down through that, and then you'll see the 2 breakout rooms available, and click on the rectangle with the green arrow to go into the one that you would like to go into. I see there's a few of you left in the main room. I'm happy to answer any questions or to help get you to a breakout room if you need assistance. Just let me know. Again, if you go next to where you saw the chat, and there's two little people in the list of attendees, and then you can scroll down to see the breakout rooms and click on the green arrow to get into the one that you would like.